So, with all the talk about whether or not Joe Biden's going to step out of this presidential race, he has said he's staying. But with all the talk about it, let's talk about what might happen should Joe need to step aside. How would that take place, and what would that mean for Kamala Harris? Well, for starters, based on the 25th Amendment, if it's temporary, Joe Biden could submit a letter to the Speaker of the House and the President pro tem of the Senate and tell them I'm incapable of being president right now. And he would not step down, but he would transfer authority to Kamala Harris. She would still be vice president, but she would then have the full authority of the office of president, and she could do whatever needs to be done. This has happened in the past. Um, for example, a routine medical procedure where Joe Biden would have to be under anesthesia for a number of hours or whatever, where he's incapable of making any sort of a decision. This has happened. Hey, I'm having this procedure done, blah, blah, blah. Then when he's back and he's fine, he submits a written declaration to both of them again, saying, I'm back, I can perform my functions again, and power shifts back to him. So if it's temporary, Kamala would remain vice president, and she would just go about doing whatever she had to do. Like I said, this has been done numerous times throughout history. Um, but what would happen if Joe Biden had to resign for whatever reason? Well, Kamala Harris would immediately become president. She would take the oath of office, and she would be acting president until she took the oath of office, but she would effectively be president. She would take the oath, she would become president, and then she would have to pick a vice president. Now, she would submit that choice to Congress, and it takes a majority vote in both houses. Now, we have the majority in the Senate, so passing the Senate wouldn't be a problem. But could she pass a vice presidential pick with this current House makeup? And I believe the Republicans have a 2 or 3 seat majority right now in the House. Could she pass a vice presidential pick? And I think the answer to that question is actually yes. Now, I know Republicans don't like to work with Democrats right now, and they would want to obstruct anything they possibly could. But I think there would be at least a few Republicans who would want to maintain our form of government, regardless of who Kamala Harris picks, and they would just confirm that pick. And then whoever she would choose would take the oath of office, just like Kamala Harris did when she became Joe Biden's vice president, and they would become the acting the vice president going forward. Wouldn't be acting; they would be vice president, and they would have to do everything that the vice president normally would do, and then going forward, they would run. That would be their campaign. That would be their ticket moving forward through this election cycle. And that whole process would play out regardless of whether we are talking about between now and the election, between the election and Inauguration Day, or after Inauguration Day next year, should something happen to Joe after he's been reelected, this same process would still play out. Again, depending on if it's temporary or permanent, would determine whether or not Kamala Harris becomes acting president or is just permanently the president going forward and would have to pick a replacement vice president. That is all contained in the 25th Amendment. That is how that would play out. Also in the 25th Amendment is should something happen to Joe Biden and he is incapable of being president, Kamala Harris can go to both the Speaker of the House and the President pro tem of the Senate and say Joe Biden is incapable of being president, and basically there's a time frame for which Joe could respond. If Joe either doesn't respond or whatever, then Kamala would have to reply back, and then the Congress would basically have to hold a vote as to whether or not they agree that with what Kamala said and that Joe Biden would be incapable of being president, or whether they agree with Joe and saying Joe's capable and Joe would remain president. I don't see that actually becoming an issue. The only way that could potentially become an issue is if something medically happened to Joe where he was incapable of getting a hold of Congress and telling them himself. But either way, I don't expect it to play out that way. I know this is kind of a longer video, but that's kind of how things would play out should Kamala have to step up and become president if something were to happen to Joe.